Hi, everybody. Greetings. Welcome to today's Cathedra webinar. You are tuning in for the third day of the 5-day Executive Director Training with your instructor, Cheryl Cosley. We're coming to you live on May 7th, 2025. My name is Brooke Warrington. I'm the Training and Development Specialist here at the Native Learning Center. We're also thrilled that you could tune in for today's webinar. If you could follow along while I read the disclaimer aloud. This webinar provides a summary of fundamental concepts, requirements, and/or procedures within the allotted 90 minutes. The material discussed does not illustrate all possible scenarios that could be applicable. We also have our copyright infringement law printed here. This is just a friendly reminder that the webinar materials are protected by copyright, trademark, trade secret, and other intellectual property laws. If you missed either day 1 or day 2, or maybe you already know you're not going to be able to make it to maybe 4 or 5, or maybe you want to recommend this awesome training to a colleague, you can find the recordings as well as all of the PDFs of the slides in the courses section here on the learning platform. And you can also explore the other webinars and trainings that we've done on this platform since we made our big transition. If this is your first time tuning in, know that you won't have to re-register for each individual day. You're already a member of the platform, so you'll just sign in at the time of the webinar starting, and you will click on that green banner at the top of your screen to join. If you found that your sound is coming out of a different device than you would prefer, you can click on the telephone icon that's down at the bottom of your screen, and that'll bring up a list of your mic and speaker devices so that you can select the proper audio output. And there are several ways to interact during today's webinar. We, of course, want to encourage class participation. We will primarily rely on use of the public chat. Most of your questions would probably be answered through the course of Cheryl's presentation, but if you want to send one into the chat, just kind of for making sure you got it down, she will address the questions at the end. And then, of course, any comments you have, any tech support issues, perhaps, you can send all that into the public chat. If yours isn't already open, you can open it by clicking on public chat in that messages panel. And then to say something, you'll click on that box where it says send message to public chat, type what you want to say, and then you can hit enter, or you can click that cute little paper airplane button and that'll send it in. We also have a list of important links that's in the shared notes. I have already put the link to today's presentation slides in the chat for you, but there's also a link to the day 1 and the day 2 recording. I'm going to put that into the chat for you as well if you want to bookmark that for later viewing if you missed one of those. And then if maybe you've sent me a tech support issue you think I missed, you could always raise your hand to draw my attention to the chat. We do, of course, want to know where everyone's tuning in from. It's nice to see all the different tribal nations that are represented. So if you could take a second to introduce yourself in the public chat, you can let us know your name, where you're tuning in from, your work or your role in Indian country that probably led you to today's webinar, and then your tribal affiliation. If you have one, you might be a tribal employee where you don't have affiliation, that's okay too. And while you guys are introducing yourselves in the chat, it is with great pleasure I introduce today's webinar instructor, Cheryl Cosley. And Cheryl, I have made you presenter now.
Thank you very, very much. Welcome, guys, to day 3. I'm glad to see that there's an executive director in here. All mission. That's awesome. Hopefully we'll give you some information today that will help you along your way and give you some guidance in the future. So Native Learning Center, it's brought to you the presentation through them, as well as the Department of Housing and Urban Development, more specifically in our case, Native programs, Native American programs. So welcome and good afternoon. My name is Cheryl Cosley. My Anishinaabe name is Redbird Woman, and I come from the Bay Mills Indian Reservation, located at the top of Michigan, and our waters actually border Canada. We're a Ojibwe or Chippewa people, and I served as Director of Housing for my tribe for 28 years. During that time, I served with the National American Indian Housing Council for 16 years, Secretary, Vice Chair, and then a 2-term chairperson. Also served with the Great Lakes Indian Housing Association as their president for 7 years. That's the 31 tribes in the Great Lakes area. Surrounding the Great Lakes, actually. And I started Cheryl Cosley and Associates in March of 2019, and I provide training and technical assistance such as this virtually and in person throughout the lower 48 and Alaska. So I've been very, very privileged to be able to do what I love. My information's at the beginning and the end. Should you ever need anything, please reach out to me. I'll try to get back to you with an answer. So the objectives today is to hopefully explain, some of the key roles and responsibility of an executive director and the executive and administrative requirements that you're going to need to know to make sure that you're properly implementing NAHASDA within, your tribe. Lots of reference materials in here. 1, 2, and 3 are your guidance documents. So those are really, really important. I would always suggest that you start with those and then use Code Talk. There's several in there that you're going to use for occupancy, calculating annual income, the HUD income limits, the guidance on assisting non-low income families. There's another one in there also from 2024 that is really good. The TDC if you're doing any building, also the contract and preference laws if you're doing building, as well as you're going to need to know about how to do your environmentals also. And then the useful life. We talked about some of that yesterday, and we'll talk about a little bit more of that today or tomorrow also. Investing, IHBG funds, that's a brand new guidance, as well as the federal supply sources just came out. So there's a lot of new guidances there. Welcome, Susanna, too. We've got 2 directors in here. That's awesome. So we're going to go on to the formula portion today, and we'll hit on policy requirements, management, Indian preference, and those preference laws, basically, in employment, some of the lease requirements over there. These are the rest of the week. Your procurement, that's very important that you know how to do that, and your conflict of interest requirements, the TDC that we talked about, and those labor requirements, and understanding the HUD office. It took me a long while to figure out who went where and who I would call for what. And then we'll finish up Friday with leveraging. So your formula, that determines basically how much you're going to get for the year. Okay. And it's used to allocate our grant funding to all the tribes and TDHEs. That formula data allows ONAP to allocate funds equitably and fairly to all of the eligible recipients. There's statutory requirements that deal with that, found within Title III of the NAHASDA Act, which is that first one in your reference materials. And the regulatory requirements are found at 1,301 through 340. So it's quite lengthy there. So the purpose in the background is to allocate those funds. Whenever they do anything with the formula, if you remember from the first day, it has to be done, if they ever change any component, through negotiated rulemaking, because they want it to be fair to everyone, across the United States. And that allocation is the basis of your annual budget. So that formula response form comes out on June 1st of every year. And it includes the data to be used in the formula and the estimated allocation for that upcoming year. Corrections due are 60 days after the date of the formula response form. Census challenge deadlines, if you said, no, we have a lot more enrolled tribal members, I'd like to challenge this formula, or I'm in an overlapping service area and I don't believe that tribe is servicing anybody here, so I should have a larger share, whatever the reason being, those are due by, for this year's June 1st date, they would have been due March 30th. So you have to have those prepared well in advance so they can have the calculations and things like that. And we have a formula response center, basically a service center that can explain that formula to you in, very, very plain English. And they can tell you how you got to where you're at. So if you ever have a question about that, that information is going to be in a couple of more slides. I would definitely take a screenshot of that, stick it somewhere, and call them up. They're really, really great people, and they can explain really well how you come to, they come to those numbers, basically. If you ever want to challenge your formula, you can do that. That is a legitimate expenditure utilizing your A&P funds also, your administrative and planning funds in your grant. So Corrections have to be submitted to the IHBG Formula Service Center on the Formula Response Form Appendices A through D. And those final allocations are completed after the budget is finally appropriated. So your final allocation can vary from the estimate based on quite a few different reasons. A different final allocation amount, or your tribe's data has changed, or someone else's tribe's data has changed. You know, the more money in, the more money out, basically. So, you know, and payback of money. People that didn't take, you know, mutual help units off of their inventory, or current assisted stock that they found out that they were receiving money and they were forced to pay it back, or something like that, will affect everybody's money. So, or I've actually seen different situations throughout the years, because I've been around so long, that all the tribes don't necessarily take their money in a particular year. I've seen them give it back. And then we've got another situation at the end here that will also, that I'm going to show you one of the factors that can affect that final allocation amount. So it's distributed, that formula, your Indian Housing Block Grant is distributed through that formula, calculated annually, depending on how much Congress appropriates, first of all. That first run produces estimated allocations. They're available online to the tribes and TDHEs by June 1st. You have to go online and get them. They used to get mailed to us and they don't anymore. Once the final allocations are completed, after the appropriations are announced, and your prior year, what they call carryover, is actually determined, they'll come up with that final formula run. You know, so the date of that final formula run varies in every year depending when the president actually signs appropriations into law. And our formula contains 4 key components. Current assisted stock. So we talked about that over the last couple of days. Those are the money, you know, the houses that were built prior to 1996 that you receive a subsidy for. There were turnkey houses, mutual help houses, and your rental units. And some that were run like Section 8. Those primarily have the Section 8 and the rentals left of that component. And those will probably be there forever. So those will continue to be part of that, you know, key portion. We have the need portion, the 1996 minimum, and the new one that I was telling you will also affect that run, your undispersed IHBG funds factor. Okay. So the formula current assisted stock is your component 1. It is, like I said, well, I just explained basically what that was. All that low rent, mutual help, turnkey, Section 8, you know, things that were built prior to NAHASDA that we receive subsidies for and continue to receive subsidies for as long as you're, you know, toeing the line and running that program the way that it was designed. Your FCAS, there's 2 elements of your FCAS, your formula current assisted stock and the formula operating subsidy and modernization allocation. Your FCAS is adjusted by the fiscal year 1996 national averages for operating subsidy and modernization allocations. And then there's a factor for local cost and inflation adjustments. So you need to report changes to information when you review. Somebody's supposed to be reviewing your information on a yearly basis from your tribe. Sometimes you don't know your enrollment amounts, you know, unless you've been sitting there in that position for a long time. And it's best to go maybe to the tribal council, or your grant writers usually have that information, as well as your enrollment, you know, so you can get some of that information from other people. Your grant writers are actually, if you have them for your tribe, they're usually a great source to help. Hey, does this look right? Do you think we're getting enough? They know, you know, a lot of those figures about how many people are of what income, and they know how many tribal members you have and things like that. So it's a good idea maybe to run that past them also. So the recipient shall report your changes of information related to your formula on your formula response form, including corrections to the number of, it'll tell you you're receiving, it says you have 4 operational mutual help and 140 rental units that were built with that you're receiving FCAS on. And if that's the case, that's how many you're supposed to be renting out. And if you're not, then you're supposed to tell them that and quit receiving the money on them, because you'll have to pay it back. So you got to be careful there. The time period shall not be less than 60 days from the date of the HUD letter transmitting the form to the recipient. So you're supposed to report those changes during that period. Your formula response form is the only mechanism that a recipient shall use to report changes to the number of your FCAS. You can always call your HUD people first and say, hey, I think I got a problem here, and then go through it with them and then get a hold of the FCAS if you want. But the actual reporting has to be done through this, particular mechanism. So when do the units under formula current assisted stock cease to be counted? Well, your mutual help should no longer be counted when you have no longer the legal right to own, operate, or maintain the unit. It could be lost by conveyance, demolition, or otherwise. Conveyance of your mutual help and turnkey is supposed to happen as soon as practicable after that unit becomes eligible for conveyance by the terms of your mutual help and occupancy agreement. They call that an MHOA. Your Indian tribe, TDHE, IHA are supposed to actively enforce strict compliance by your home buyers, enforcing the terms and conditions of that mutual help and occupancy agreement, including the requirements for full and timely payment. So they convey those units when they're supposed to. So if it's not conveyed after it becomes eligible for conveyance, there's certain steps, depending upon legal impediments and things like that. No later than 4 months after the unit becomes eligible for conveyance. The tribe is supposed to create a written plan of action, which includes a description of specific legal impediments, as well as specific ongoing and appropriate actions for each applicable unit that have been taken and will be taken time to resolve those legal impediments within. They want it done within a 24-month period. So there's specific rules, and they apply mostly to those mutual help and turnkey units, because most of those should have been conveyed already. Okay, so the tribe, TDHE, IHA has carried out or is carrying out the written plan of action and documented the undertaking of that action, and no unit, mutual help, or turnkey is going to be considered FCAS 24 months after the date the unit became eligible for conveyance, unless you as a tribe or TDHE, provide evidence from a third party, such as a court, a state or federal government agency, documenting that legal impediment continues to prevent that conveyance. And if they haven't been conveyed, almost 10 years ago now, 2016, it's supposed to be treated as having become eligible for conveyance on December 22nd of 2016. So if you legally think you have mutual help, you need to look at your documents, find out if they're listed, and then call them and ask them. Sometimes they just take them off the books, but if you have mutual help tenants, and I know of places where there are some, you have to do your diligence and find out about that. So your rental units continue to be included on that formula as long as you continue to operate them as a low-income rental unit. Can't be a VASH unit, because that would be like double dipping, because there's a subsidy with those. Can't be a laundromat. It has to be a living quarters, such as that. Your expired Section 8 units shall continue as rental units, be included in the formula as long as they are operated as low-income rental units and included in your formula response form. So unit conversion, the final rule adds a new law, basically, which adds the existing unit coverage policy to the regulation. Before the final rule went into effect, our tribes were only required to report the units converted before October of '97. Under this new rule, which began in 2018, we're required to report all unit conversions on your formula response form. So what happens is you've had a family in a mutual help unit for years and years, and then they no longer have, a family or a successor to that unit. Housing authority takes it back and they don't operate that mutual help program anymore or whatever. They'll sometimes turn that over to a rental unit, or they'll turn a rental into a mutual help. So that's what they're talking is flip-flopping, that. So demolished units, if it's pursuant to a planned demolition, it can be considered eligible as an FCAS unit if that unit is rebuilt within 1 year. And we talked about that, I think, on day 2 yesterday. Might have been the day before. And that basically anything that you receive that money on, you have to make sure that those houses are repaired and up and running, as soon as possible, whether it be a fire or a demolition disposition. You just have to make sure, that they don't sit empty, because you're collecting money on them through that FCAS. Okay. So if you can't do it within the 1 year, you always get a hold of the HUD office first, tell them what's going on, and then you'll go to the formula center, and they have to be in writing, and you include the justification for the request. We had to put it out for bid numerous times, which set us back. And then because of the weather, we couldn't, have them fully occupied within the year, or whatever the reason is. We found a box turtle and it slowed up, the construction, or whatever the reason is. So there's units, like I said, not eligible for FCAS. The units that you built over the amount, because like I said, we used to basically get awarded rental units, mutual help units. We used to do that in a competition. And there was times I would get 10 and be able to build 11. I was good with my money, so I was going to build one more unit. Well, that 11th unit didn't necessarily always get money. After 1997, it didn't get money. You would only get money for the 10 that they awarded you. Units that are not used as a low-income housing dwelling unit, conveyance eligible, conveyed, or demolished unit, or units that you construct with NAHASDA funds, they're not current assisted stock. There's no subsidy attached to them. Units being used for your VASH program because you're getting a subsidy through VASH. And vacant units, unless you're being, in the process of making them available for occupancy, or like I said, units used for non-dwelling purposes. So reviewing that FCAS data, review your formula response form, report any corrections to unit counts, unit types, actual expected data, full availability, for that occupancy, and those submitted corrections are going to be reviewed. HUD will actually be the one that informs the tribe of your corrected unit count. So what would happen if you misreport or fail to correct a formula current assisted stock form? Well, they find you responsible for that accuracy. And if you receive an overpayment because you failed to do that, you're going to be forced to repay those funds within 5 fiscal years. Okay. And it depends on how long they went back that it wasn't right. A recipient will not be provided back funding for any unit that you failed to report, that you should have been getting credit for because you didn't report it. And HUD has 3 years from the date of a formula response form to take action against any recipient that fails to correct or make appropriate changes on that form. Review of your FCAS is going to be accomplished by HUD as a component of your audits, routine monitoring, or sometimes they can do an FCAS target monitoring, or other reviews. HUD will come on site, usually to your housing place. It used to be supposed to be every 4 to 5 years. It's more like 6 to 7, depending upon your size and if you have open audits, if your IHPs and APRs are on time, and how much money you receive. So all those things weigh in there. If you're doing really well and your audits are coming in, you don't have any findings anywhere, you don't get a lot of money, sometimes it'll take them longer to get to where you're at. So that's just the way it goes. They're going to look at those high risk people first. So you find your formula data through, that's an active link here, or you go on to Code Talk, you can find it there. But you should make sure that you look at those documents. The second component is your need component, okay? It consists of 7 criteria. It's based on the decennial census, the American Community Service, it's called ACS, 5-year data, and it's adjusted for your local development cost. These are the need components. You know, how many people that you have are rent burdened, which means, you know, more than rent. How many houses do you have overcrowded? How much, you know, of a housing shortage? How many do you have at poverty level, you know, between under 30%? How many do you have that are very low income, between 30 and 50%? How many do you have that are low income, between 50 and 80? How many American Indian Alaska Native people do you have? So all of those are factors there. And then you have your formula area. That is your geographic area that you provide substantial housing services to. Your formula area and your Indian area are 2 different things. Okay, so. And what if your formula area is served by more than one Indian tribe? I'm in an overlapping service area. Now, I have a sister tribe 20 miles away from me. I fully expect to be an overlapping tribe with them. I have one of their tribal members, so is my husband, you know. So my grandchildren are very, very, you know, closer, not on the reservation, but right there between the 2 of us. But then when I started looking at it, I had a tribe that's like 3.5 hours from here. It's like, show me where they've got their people and they're serving them on my reservation, you know, or within this area. So you can argue those points if you need to, but your Indian tribe's formula area overlaps with the formula area of one or more other tribes. The funds allocated to that Indian tribe for the geographic area in which the formula areas overlap will be divided based on the tribe's proportional share of the population in the overlapping geographic area and the commitment to service that proportional share of the population within that geographic area. And then there's some other little caveats. In a case where it's a state recognized tribe, if that formula area overlaps with the federally recognized Indian tribe, the federally recognized tribe will receive the allocation for that overlapping area. And then tribal membership in your geographic area, not to include duly enrolled tribal members. It's going to be based on all the data that the tribes involved agree to use. A lot of times the agreed upon usage is the census, the Indian Health Service data, and our BIA data. If the tribes can't agree on which source they want to use, HUD's going to make the decision, and they will make that decision by August 1st, you know, how they're going to divide those funds. And then there's a population cap in there, controlled to maintain fairness, you know, only if your American Indian, Alaska Native is more than 2 times your enrollment. And there is a challenge process available. The third component is the 1996 hold harmless. So your level of funding is never supposed to drop below what you received in 1996 as an Indian Housing Authority, as a TDHE. You know, we didn't have tribes didn't have at that point. It was one of the 2. Well, it was Indian Housing Authority. So that's the amount that they received in fiscal year 1996 for operating and modernization. And that funding is adjusted to the amount that they received in 1996. It's a statutory requirement. You're never supposed to fall below that amount, okay? So the new formula, or the new factor in the formula, is called an undispersed block grant funds factor. And it doesn't affect very many of our tribes, but it has a big effect on that overall amount of money. It provides adjustments for tribes who have an initial allocation of $5 million or more per year, okay? And they have undispersed funds greater than the sum of their prior 3 years allocation. So if they got 8 million one year, 6 million last year, 7 million this year. That would be $21 million. That allocation would be reduced. Any amounts recovered would be redistributed to everyone, okay? If they have more than 21 million sitting like within their locks using those three figures. And they receive over that 5 million when this year's money hit. So that's the way they figured it was the fairest way to do that. But that was what you know, undispersed funds factor is. But it affects very few tribes, like I said. The amount of the initial allocation, you know, 5 million or more, they have to have over 3 years in excess, you know, in the ELOCs, okay? Or it's 1996 minimum. So your formula response form, HUD will notify you, as I said, on June 1st, the data to be used in the formula. It's the projected amount, and it's required by regulation. So you get on there and you can start seeing that, and you use that in preparation of, you know, your IHP. All formula response forms and final allocations will no longer be mailed. You have to go online and actually grab them or get them yourself. So if you need to correct it or challenge that data, you can challenge the need portion of your formula. You have to provide that data is gathered, evaluated, presented in a manner fair and equitable to all the participating tribes. You have until March 30th of each year to submit the challenges to the need data in consideration for the upcoming year. So as I said, if June 1st is coming up, if you were going to challenge that, you would have had it done for this year by March 30th. And this is the information. This is what I would take a picture of real quick for you new ladies, if you are new and want to learn more about your formula. These people can explain it to you better than anybody that I know, okay? And they're there for you, and they're real good. So eligible activities, okay? Have to make sure that when you're spending that money, it is an actual eligible activity that you do. They're housing activities that develop or support housing for rental or home ownership, provide housing services for affordable housing. Affordable means to benefit low-income Native families. Exceptions are made, again, remember we talked about the essential families and the law enforcement, as defined at 24 CFR 1024. Some of the things we can do, the Indian Housing Assistance, primarily, you know, that 1937 Act housing, modernization, operations, maintenance, and subsidies. You can do development with our funds, acquisition, construction, rehab, conversion, and energy improvements. We are allowed to provide counseling, self-sufficiency classes, homeless prevention, rental assistance, and promote youth activities. Because remember, they took a couple of our programs away, and they said if you want to offer them, you take that out of your money and you put, you know, that into your IHP, and you do that activity that way. So that's how we're allowed to do that. Housing management services, loan processing, inspections, management, grant writers, maintenance. Those are some of those areas. What we used to do is one of the staff, my deputy, actually came from a banking industry, and she could run background checks. We got the software to do that. Not background, excuse me. Those were ran somewhere else. She would run the credit checks, and we would do credit counseling. If that is what first thing you do is take a grasp and look at them and see if they're prepared, you know, for mortgage or anything like that. We do the credit counseling, rebuild that. You know, a lot of times in Indian country, it's because of an IHS bill or something that wasn't paid promptly, things like that. Try to correct it. We would offer down payment assistance, and we became a one-stop kind of shop. We had the land department. We ran the utilities. We ran the IHS, you know, the water, sewer, those type of programs all in-house. The land, like I said, on the reservation, So the land department was there for the leases, and then we could, dependent upon how that credit turned out, along with the down payment assistance, we'd put them in a USDA program. If they were the lowest of low income, we'd utilize the 184. If it was, so to medium, and if it was good, then we would get them a conventional loan, which was actually the cheapest for them, but the hardest to obtain. And then we found out that they would need help building the house because, putting a house, we used to do that for them also. And then we would make sure at the end, it was like, okay, we'll try to make sure that you have a really good subcontractor to help you through this portion of it. But you can do that for your tribal members. Crime prevention and safety. You can do physical improvements, security personnel, equipment, administrative and planning, salaries, benefits, your IHP prep, your APR preparation, monitoring, administrative cost related activities, challenger formula, model activities. Those ones require a special HUD approval. You can build offices, warehouses. I did both of those. I've been to areas, one of my clients, had a daycare center on their reservation. Community buildings, we did that. Community generator systems. I've seen places where they build storm, shelters and things like that for them. All sorts of things that you can do like that. And there is a new guidance that is in your reference material, Indian Housing Block Grant Model Activity Request, and it walks you through a lot of the common ones and the ones that you will, need more help to do, okay? And interpreting eligible activity categories. So this should help you as young new directors with that, okay, for your IHP. So I would definitely grab this one if you haven't grabbed this reference material yet. It's got a lot of, good information in it for you. Who's going to be assisted? It tells you basically how it walks through some of the steps you have to do on your IHP and APR. Talks about useful life and things like that, moderate design, all of that. So it's good information for you. And then there's one in there, determining and using program income, because that's one of the first things. What is program income? So housing related activities for purposes of program income refers to any facility, community building, infrastructure, business program, activity, including community development or economic development activity that is determined by you as the recipient to be beneficial to the provision of housing within your Indian area, would meet at least one of the following conditions. It's going to help the Indian tribe or their TDHE to reduce the cost of construction of Indian housing, or make housing more affordable or energy efficient, accessible, or practicable within your Indian area, or would otherwise advance the purposes of NAHASDA. So that is in your reference materials also under 25. Okay, so your compliance and your policies, okay? So you gotta have policies. They have to be up to date. Your governing body should be looking at them at least every couple of years. They say every year, every couple of years anyway. Section 203 in NAHASDA requires that you have certain policies that are adopted. The oldest guidance about this goes back to 2011 on the required policies, though, if you want to search in there. I don't think I put it in there this time. I think I pulled it out thinking that it was outdated. Then I called, because I actually asked within the last 2 weeks, one of my HUD office personnel that have been there for a long, long time. And they said, no, Cheryl, that is the most recent guidance on, your policies. And it dates back to 2011. So the statute itself requires certain policies be adopted. Rents, each recipient will develop written policies governing rents and homebuyer payments, including the methods that such rents and homebuyer payments are determined. So you got to say, I'm going to use, the internal revenue method, service, or I'm going to use Section 8 definition, how you're going to come up with charging that rent. The maximum rent, in any case, of a low-income family in a dwelling unit assisted with grant amounts under this act, you cannot charge them over 30%. Okay. Maintenance and efficient operation, we're supposed to have maintenance policies. Each recipient who owns or operates responsible for any funding of any entity for housing developed or operated pursuant to, a contract under the 1937 Act or NAHASDA. Such amounts may be necessary to provide for the continued maintenance and efficient operation of such housing. The subsection may not be construed to prevent any recipient from demolishing or disposing of Indian housing referred to in this subsection pursuant to regulations established by the Secretary. You always get HUD approval before you demolish any kind of home that was paid for using our, those type of funds, though, guys. Don't. You can do demolition disposition. I did it with 10 of them, but you have to have permission all the way through. So insurance coverage, the basic thought on the insurance coverage when you read about it all over, if it could have been and should have been covered by insurance, they're not going to find it an eligible replacement with HUD funds. Okay, you should have had it insured is the way they look at it. So anything that should be insured, insure it. Each recipient shall maintain adequate insurance coverage for, of course, your housing units also, owned and operated and assisted with grant amounts. You have to have eligibility for admission. You're going to develop written policies governing eligibility, admission, and occupancy of families for housing assisted with grant amounts provided under the Act. Management and maintenance. You're going to develop policies governing the management and maintenance of housing assisted with grant amounts. Okay, so you got to have a maintenance policy. Your rents and homebuyer payments policy regarding rents and homebuyer payments. You should have a good collection policy also. Charge for dwelling units assisted with NAHASDA funds, including the methods by which such rents and homebuyer payments are determined. Read that, section 203 in NAHASDA. The policy would also address the tribe's TDHE's requirements for collection of payments. You need to charge them the correct amount, and then you need to collect it. Like I said, you can't get a finding for your TARs anymore, which is your tenant account receivables, but you will get a concern, which you still have to answer. So it's just as good, basically, or just as bad as a finding. So you need to collect your monies owed. The minute that you quit collecting money, the minute everybody will quit paying you, and you'll be in a hurting position. So eligibility, admission, and occupancy, the policies addressing those of families and housing assisted with NAHASDA funds. You can read about that at section 203 of the statute. Subjects that should be addressed in each policy: eligibility, address the 3 types of eligible participants, including low income, non-low income, and non-Indian. Admission, ensure fair treatment. Remember, they want you to treat all your tribal members the same. Who apply for housing assistance, the policy should address all programs managed. Provisions for preferences, if any, should address how conflicting requirements for mixed financing will be addressed. For example, funding provided by other federal programs can prohibit or may prohibit discrimination based on race, in accordance with the Fair Housing Act. When these funds are combined with NAHASDA, which, we're exempt for fair housing, we get the money on the benefit of low-income Native Americans. We're allowed to do that. There's a conflict. And then occupancy, requirements for continued occupancy, what your grounds for termination of a housing lease or a sales contract could be. Some of the grounds, you can't list them all. But your management and maintenance policies, addressing management maintenance of your housing assisted with NAHASDA funds, although not specifically specified by statute or regulation. Management policies could include, or should include, policies, personnel policies, grievance policies. You're going to need 3 grievance policies. You need grievance of your tenants, grievance of your staff, and then you actually need a grievance for Indian preference. that I believe is described tomorrow, and capitalization and disposition. The first time I had a HUD monitoring, I didn't have a good enough capitalization policy. I think that was the only finding that I had, and I was mad. I was mad because I had asked for technical assistance, and the person that provided it came in, and I said, why didn't you check for one of these? Because I didn't want to have any findings, but they have to find something, so Section 203 and 207 require grant recipients adopt written policies in the following areas. Tenant and homebuyer selection must include criteria which is consistent with the purpose of providing housing for low-income families. Reasonably related to program eligibility, the ability for the applicant to perform obligations of the lease. Provide for the selection of tenants. Homebuyer from a written waiting list in accordance with the policy and goals set forward in your Indian housing plan for the tribe that is the grant beneficiary of such amounts, and the prompt notification in writing to any rejected applicant of the rejection and the grounds for rejection. Okay. When you write your policy, make sure that you clarify in the policy we're going to use calendar days or we're going to use business days. It makes a difference to the reader, and they'll catch that if you don't. It'll be a suggestion that you get. So your fiscal and your financial management, you refer to 2 CFR Part 200, post-federal award, requirements for standards for financial and program management. You can read about that under 200, sections 300 through 309 of that uniform. Reference materials number 3, okay? My least favorite, this is the one that's all financial, and it will be audit everything related to any of the policies that you have to have there. Your procurement, the spending of money basically is covered by that. So refer to 1026 also in our regs for administrative requirements for NAHASDA specific requirements. Okay, back to 200. At 318, it talks about general standards, documented procurement procedures, of course, and you have to conform to federal, state, local, and tribal laws and regulations. So you're going to look from different places. The regulations at 1026 require compliance with 2 CFR, 317 through 326 when it comes to procurement. The language at 318 requires grantees, sub-grantees to use their own procurement procedures which reflect applicable state and local laws and regulations, provided that that procurement conforms to the applicable federal laws and standards identified within that section. And the regulations at 203.18 also require grantees, sub-grantees maintain written code of standards of conduct governing the performance of employees engaged in the award and the administration of contracts. So when we get to the conflict of interest provisions, you're going to see more about that because it's going to apply to the people that are awarding your contracts. So if it's your board of commissioners and some of the staff, and the conduct basically of the staff and your board of commissioners, when it comes down to conflict of interest in the administration of contracts also. Okay, because that's the federal funds. You got to be real careful there. Tribal and Indian preference can be incorporated into your procurement, or you can have a separate policy where the recipients are subject to 7B, the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act, and Section 3 of the Indian Financing Act, in accordance with 1048 through 52. It requires recipients have policies consistent with the section cited above. Also 1054 on Indian preference complaint procedure. So that's what I was talking to about that grievance thing. Requires tribal policies that meet or exceed the requirements listed under that citation. So the word of warning there is meet or exceed. I did have a tribe that had rewritten that grievance policy under the tribal and Indian preference. I believe it was like a 20-day complaint period, and they tried to move it to 14, shorten the time. And we showed it to HUD and they're like, nope, it's got to meet or exceed. It can't deviate from that. So I believe we have a sample in here over the next day to see that. Or I can show you where to get it, but you've got to use the law at 1054 when you write that to make sure that it's compliant. So real property acquisition, relocation, we're subject to those laws. You can read about them at 1014, and it's also governed by 49 CFR Part 24, the Uniform Relocation Assistance and Real Property Acquisition for federally and federally assisted programs. The regulations at 24103, A and D respectively require us to develop minimum standards for our appraisals, as well as criteria for determining the minimum qualification of appraisers that we use if we're going to buy land, okay? And we're not allowed to pay over fair market. Just a little something. So the applicable relocation and real property acquisition policies shall include or cover the following at 1014. Acquisition requirements subject to 49 CFR Part 24 Subpart B. Based on the appraisal value, you can accept donated property or purchase property at less than fair market value. Requires HUD approval if your purchase price exceeds the fair market value. You're supposed to always take steps to minimize displacement. All really reasonable steps to minimize the displacement of persons, households, businesses, nonprofit organizations. Temporary relocation. We would, in case you have to, covers tenants and homebuyer relocation cost, adequate advance notice if you need to make them move for any reason. I remember trying to do a rehab and keeping 2 units open and having to move the tenants into these units while we completely rehabbed their house because they couldn't stay there, but they wanted to go back to their houses. We put washer and dryers, supplied, full cable package, give them boxes. Our maintenance guys helped move them. We did everything we could to relocate them and not really massively inconvenience them. Allowed the mail to still go to the same place, while we did the rehab in those houses, one by one by one by one. Oh, that was hard. But you can also come across something, let's say you have an apartment building and there's a fire in one portion and you have to, there's no electricity through the rest of it, or somebody uses meth and it, could contain, contaminate something else. You never know the situation. And whenever you are in doubt, when it comes to that, you call your HUD office. They are there to help you and they will. Hey, I got this situation. Do I have to worry about any, type of relocation or real property acquisition? And they'll tell you, or they'll run it up the chain. They're good for that and they're there to help you. So the requirements at 1014, relocation assistance for displaced persons, permanent relocation has to comply with the URA, Real Property Acquisition Act of 1970 as amended, and the regulations at 49 CFR Part 24. You have to allow for written appeals to you as the recipient, and your responsibilities that you comply with that at 49 CFR 24 and 1014. Cost of that required relocation assistance is an eligible NAHASDA cost. It can be paid for funds, from you or the tribe if you can get it. The way it reads, they want you to try to get it from the tribe first, but you shall maintain records in sufficient detail to demonstrate compliance. So during COVID and times like this, times such as that, I saw where a couple of tribes thought about buying empty apartment buildings and empty hotels and things like that. But they weren't completely empty. There was still people in them, and these would have kicked in and it stopped them actually from doing that, because then you're responsible for those people also. So relocation acquisition has to comply with URA. Read about that at 1014 and maintain records to demonstrate compliance. If you have any questions, always call the HUD office for that. Notify your relocating families, individuals, businesses, other affected parties. Have to sometimes pay that temporary relocation and displacement benefit, and it is an eligible cost from your NAHASDA funds. You got to negotiate that fair market value when it's a voluntary transaction, and you follow the involuntary procedures when it's required by the URA. All of our properties are, subject to cost and design standards also. We are supposed to build of what they call moderate design, and you follow the TDC. Defined as housing that is of a size and amenity consisted with unassisted housing offered for sale within your general geographic area. So that's what you're comparing it to. So it's going to come out as moderate unless you're sitting, like Mashpee in the middle of, a very high income area. Tribe's general geographic area to buyers who are at or below the area median income. So that's what it's kind of hard, to go much over that standard, unless you're in a really high cost area and there's, different provisions you can take. Development activities, acquisition, new construction, moderate, substantial rehab of affordable housing, or homebuyer assistance and model activities. You can read about that at 1056 through 58. Per 158, the ways in which a recipient demonstrates meeting those moderate design requirements as described at 1156, you need to either utilize the total development cost, and there's a brand new one that came out in 2024, and it is in your reference materials at number 11. It's PIH 2024-28. I would expect that another one will come out probably within the next year if any tariffs come into effect for lumber, for metal, for, all of those construction materials. It's going to be similar to COVID. Our estimates are going to be off. They're going to be way low. And they'll have to publish something. And sometimes what they'll do is they'll say you could have a 20% variance, So the guidance prior to 2024 showed you, how that sometimes comes about to give you an idea. So it has to be available for review by the public upon request by HUD. You have to complete a comparison of the costs using your housing standards and your TDC for the area. If you're going to go above that amount, basically. It doesn't require HUD approval if the cost does not exceed 10% of your published TDC maximum cost for the project. Okay, so those are some of the rules when it comes to that. But that TDC is a good document for you to, make sure that you utilize and adhere to. Non-dwelling structures have to support an affordable housing activity, design, size, features, and amenities. They have to be reasonable. You can read about that at 1060. If you're going to utilize funds from two different places, okay, whoever has the strictest rules, that's who's you got to go by, okay? You can adopt written standards for non-dwelling structures, describe your criteria to be used, cost, size, design, etc. Your standards have to be able to support the reasonableness and the necessity for factors used within that activity. You have to document a need or a problem to be solved and how it solves or supports affordable housing activities as required under 1062. So you also need cash management policies. Now your auditor, my auditor anyway, always was full of those ideas. Okay, you're accepting cash, you're accepting it in the one area through here. I would put up, and they almost look like baby gates to me, metal gates with dingers on them. So whoever goes through that gate, you can hear a dinger going off within the office. One of the things they did, who can empty, because we had a drop box coming into the housing authority. Who can receive that? You should have a camera on that. They give us ideas always to help with cash management. The more people you have, the easier it is. The less staff you have, then you have those overlapping duties. The person that counts the cash shouldn't be receiving it or depositing it, or, all those multiple steps that you want to have in place. If you don't have, if you're one of those staff of two that I've come across before, well, then you're going to pretty much touch everything, so you have to take that into consideration, but your auditor will help with that. Travel, okay, that's regulated two different places. It's actually under the book 200, but 24 CFR 1026 states that you'll comply with the requirements and standards set forth at 2 CFR 200-474, requires that grantees use the federal travel standards in the absence of a local governmental unit travel policy. So if you're utilizing the tribes, they'll find that sufficient. If not, you use GSA, that, you know, at 200-474. Drug-free workplace certifications required. You know, you can read about that at 24 CFR 24-600. There used to be a HUD form 570, requires the recipient to certify that you published a statement notifying employees, you know, about the drug-free workplace, provided each employee engaged in the performance of work under, you know, your IHB, a copy of the written statement. And then you'll find out different situations the longer you have been there that you're going to need to develop different policies and procedures and standards. And they're required under certain circumstances. Some of these, investment and internal control, if you want to become an investment tribe. There's brand new guidance out this year on it, 2025-05. That's reference material 21. In addition, investment policies and procedures are required, you know, all the way back to PIH Notice 1996. There's different requirements there. Your housing standards, NAHASDA regulations regarding revisions to cost limits, Native American housing at 1,158. You either adopt written standards for your affordable housing programs that reflect the requirements at 156, or you comply, like I just said, with the total development cost. More information can be found within that guidance at reference material 11 on the TDAC. Additional areas: eligibility, admissions, occupancy, rents charged, methods of calculation, management, maintenance of assisted housing, procurement, conflicts of interest in procurement, settlement of any procurement or contractual and administrative issue, your travel policies, your relocation and property acquisition, overarching administrative requirements found at 1026, drug-free requirements, moderate housing standards, your total development cost, conflicts of interest, that's in admissions normally, 30, 32, 34, and 36. Complaints and issues stemming from Indian preference, that's at 1054. That's when you can't shorten the days on. And eligible families, tenant preference and selection, your applicable income limits, your definition of low income, definition of gross annual income, eligible activities, proof of adoption of all required policies. Keep the proof of adoption with your policy. Your inspections, we're going to give you this many days, you know, notice. You can cancel too. If you fail to do your inspections or your recertifications, we will evict you. It is mandatory, you know, that should be within your A&O policy. That type of, they need to know they can be evicted if they don't conform to the things that you have to do. Useful life, uniform relocation, assistance, conflict of interest in admissions, and in contracting, procurement, TDC, finance, personnel. The other required policies for your individual program policies, your collection policies, your grievance policies, tenant, staff, and Indian preference, drug-free workplace, criminal background checks. If you're going to do that, you're going to need your policy for that. You're going to need a cash management policy, a procurement policy, capitalization, disposition, inventory. You're supposed to be inventorying all your maintenance products once a year. Travel policy, personnel policy, things like that. There's a lot. And then you have your optional tribal laws. So tribal employment contract preference laws, tribal preference law or regulation ordinance governing preferences in employment and contracting. Most tribes have them. We're going to hire any Bay Mills member first. Any applicant with a Bay Mills spouse any applicant with Bay Mills children, any other Native, you know, whatever order they go to, and then it normally goes in reverse for layoff. Tribal preference, you know, program guidance 2013-07, which is in your reference materials 12, talk about those preference laws. Tribal preference, recipients meet the Section 3 requirements when they comply with employment and contract preference laws used by or adopted by your tribe in accordance with Section 101 of NAHASDA. Indian and tribal preference requirements should be referenced in your procurement policy and your personnel policy. Tribal laws pertaining to the use of a tribally determined wage rate. Okay, that's found reference material 13. We're going to talk about that later, so I'm not going to go into it right now. Indian preference requirements, we're going to, in accordance with Section 101, you're going to apply the tribal employment and contract preference laws, including the regulations and tribal ordinances adopted by the tribe that receives the benefit from the funds granted to the recipient under NAHASDA. In the absence of tribal employment and contract preference laws, a recipient must, to the greatest extent feasible, give preference in the award of funds or contracts funded under this part to Indian organizations, Indian-owned economic enterprises, in accordance with Section 7B of the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act. And those are your tribal preference references, 1048, applicable to your IHBG activities, applicable to your administrative activities under 50, under 52, your assisted procurement activities, and then the program guidance that talks about preference and employment and contracting. Other guidances, your conflict of interest and housing admission, your insurance requirements, and your useful life and binding commitments, because you're going to need that policy also, and then the policies regarding that required insurance. Certification and compliance with 102 of the NAHASDA titled Indian Housing Plans, the tribe or TDHE has to certify that you have all those policies in effect. So if you're a brand new director and you go through your policies, because that's the first thing you guys need to ask for, show me any adopted policies. You got to make sure that at least at a minimum, you have the ones that you certify that you have in your IHP and APR in effect. And you have to have proof of adoption with them. When they come in, that's what they say. Show me in the meeting minutes, and they will review every set of meeting minutes you have. You also need to let your tribal council know that if they are making any decisions as far as your housing organization goes, you need copies of those meeting minutes also. They're going to go through them during the audits and the HUD, especially the HUD monitoring, okay? It's important that you have all your meeting minutes. Other federal law requirements, we have to follow non-discrimination laws, the Age Discrimination Act of 1975, Section 504, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, with use of the American with Disabilities Act of 1990, the Indian Civil Rights Act of 1968, Title VI, Title VIII of the Civil Rights Act of 1968. We talked about the uniform relocation, real property acquisition. We're going to talk about Davis-Bacon, NEPA. You guys, before you spend any money every year, you're supposed to go through this process with your environmental stuff. And we're going to talk about that too. Flood Disaster Protection Act. We talked about the flood insurance. Lead-based paint poisoning. We briefly talked about that. This is where you get into trouble. You know when your units were built. Okay, so you're going to make a statement, put it on the outside of your tenant form. All of our units were built after, 1979, therefore they contain no lead-based paint. If you give down payment assistance, if you do modernization, if you do rehab, if you do any of that, you have to make sure that the lead-based paint is not present where that money is going, okay? So you have to have somebody in charge of that. And then the 2 CFR Part 200, your Uniform Administrative Act. And that's a consolidation of all those OMB guidances. So if any of your finance stuff reference an A87 number or any number with an A on it, it needs to be redone, okay? Acknowledgement statements can be helpful. I like the one for our policies. If you ever utilize them, you should always ask your attorney to review and approve that acknowledgement. But this is the one that, the second one that I like and I utilized. 2 copies of it with a signature and a date line in it at the very back of your policy book that you give your tenant. Okay. I have received the tenant handbook, which outlines both my obligation, my privileges as a tenant. I agree to familiarize myself with the contents of this book, seek clarification of any item that I do not understand. I also agree to comply with the standards and rules outlined in this document. You go through all the policies with them before you get ready to move them in. You have them sign both pages and you tear out the back one and you stick it in their file. And you keep the other one attached to the policy book that you send them with. And then if there is a breach, you pick it up and you say, here, it says right here, you signed that you would check out, to see if you were supposed to do this. It helps. Okay. So the other one is basically for like a personnel policy book. You've received a copy of the handbook policy procedure. I understand it's my obligation to read and understand the material, abide by the rules established by the organization. I understand I'm governed by these policies and procedures and that the organization can and may change them at will. If you wanted to, you could put that in your policy book. So when you're looking and reviewing all your policies, first of all, are they compliant? Second of all, do you have proof of adoption? If it says draft on it, I do a lot of policy work. I go and they'll say, please, I'm new. I want to make sure I'm NAHASDA compliant. That's what they'll ask for, review of policies. And I go on site, couple of visits, go through stuff with them, sometimes do it virtually. And you have to look at every policy there. And I've worked on things for a couple of weeks. And then somebody, hey, I found a new one. Or I've been there when HUD's there or an auditor's there and they'll ask for a policy and you see all these blank looks and they can't find anything. Or the only one they find says draft on them. Get all your policies together, put them all in one place, have the proof of adoption behind them, then go through them and see if they're compliant. Okay. Now, this is the other huge part of that when you're working with the policy, because this is the ED. Chances are you're going to be the one writing the policy. Then you give them to your board of commissioners to adopt. The policy versus the practice. The written policy is adopted by your housing oversight board. What's actually done by the staff to deal with those various situations? An effective policy, one that will work based on the procedures to implement the policy. If you're going to say no trailers, no boats, nothing parked in the parking lot, there better not be any trailers or boats parked in the parking lot. If you're going to say no vehicles allowed parked on the front lawn in front of the houses, you got to make sure that there's none there. Otherwise, take it out. Because if something happens, if it has to do with an abandoned car and a kid gets locked in a trunk or blocks come down, they're going to ask to see, they're going to try to sue you, first of all. Then they're going to ask to see your policy. And it's going to say no abandoned vehicles or it must be licensed and insured. And then they're going to go start counting. And if they get to 2 or 3, you have lost your case. Don't put into policy something that you're not going to enforce. You're strategically, ethically better off taking it out. Because, it can get you into trouble. So don't adopt a policy you're not going to enforce. No inoperable vehicles on your housing properties. How do you, what is inoperable? All vehicles have to have valid plates and insurance. That's what we went to kind of, not the guy's Chevy that's back there that he's going to fix up one day, don't store it there. Your policies have to be dated and kept with proof of adoption. If your NAHASDA required policies are not fully prepared or updated, your housing program can be relying on obsolete, outdated, incorrect information for the management of your IHBG funded activities. And you can inadvertently be in non-compliance. Those are some of the most important things that you have. Okay, they're your backbone. Just know that. Okay. So the best practice: review them, ensure they're compliant, prepare a unified binder or another depository. Keep one set whole. Okay. If somebody wants it, make a copy, put it immediately back in there, or make multiple copies. Give them away to your heart's content, because when somebody asks for a policy, you're supposed to give it to them. Doesn't matter who it is. But you keep your one set that nobody touches, so you know where they're at a moment's notice. Okay. Labeled, all those policies required under NAHASDA, dated with reference showing the approval of your governing body. That's huge, guys. Have a policy status table. There's a sample in your reference materials. Update it, utilize it for whatever you want. Required by, what's your current status? When was it actually adopted? Here's your travel policy. Here's the personnel policy. Here's the procurement policy. Here's the Indian preference. Here's the Indian preference grievance policy. It actually goes bigger than that once you start with it. Okay. Codes of conduct. If you make them sign, different things, vehicle use, cell phone use, Facebook use, there's all sorts of different ones. So, that's what it is to policy. It's really, really important. Use those reference materials to make sure that you're compliant. Okay. So you're monitoring your reporting requirements. You have to do it as part of your APR. Okay. But it's supposed to ensure that you are compliant with your rules and your requirements, with the tribe, with your policies, with your procedures, consistent with the IHP. Because in your IHP and your APR, there's a whole list of them when you're accepting that money that you say that you have in place, that you're efficient, that you're effective, that you demonstrate, that accountability for your performance. It will help you build your organizational capacity, identify your system weaknesses, improve efficiency and your effectiveness of your practices, and ensure that compliance with your regulations. Self-monitoring is the process of recording the operations of a system, observing, reviewing activities over the course of a year, detecting deficiencies, taking steps to correct them, reporting through your APR, that assessment, your annual compliance assessment, that you've checked all these, that they're in place, and you observe and you review the activities over the whole course of the year. You don't wait until 2 weeks before the APR is due to do your self-monitoring, or otherwise you're just making it up. Procurement should not be done during the building season. You don't do the A&O department during the middle of your research or your inspections. There's different components for all of them that you should try to do during the winter or your off times. You assess the compliance with the IHP, the law, and the regulations. So NAHASDA 403 requires periodic monitoring, not less frequently than annually. It says that you're going to do this. Review the activities conducted, the housing assisted under the Act. Got to have your boots in every single unit at least once a year, as well as doing this and doing the research. Such review shall include an on-site inspection of housing to determine compliance with those applicable requirements. The results of the review have to be included in your performance report, submitted to the secretary, and made public. That's why you put it out for that public comment. You're responsible for monitoring your grant activities to ensure compliance with the applicable federal requirements and monitoring goals under the IHP. So you have to monitor your grant activities in accordance with that, complete a compliance assessment, including all of your unit inspections, develop corrective action plans to address any areas of noncompliance. While reviewing the admissions and occupancy department, we discovered a tenant family that was admitted who was not income eligible. How did we fix that? We all took an A&O class. Everybody that touched the, takes any A&O information, took an A&O class. Didn't slap a big old red piece of paper on the front of there. When they come in and they do their monitoring, they take a sampling, okay? 10%, 10 files or 10%, whichever is greater. You never know which ones they're going to pull. Okay. If they pull one with a big red flag on the front of it, they're going to say, wow, well, we know what we're going to find in this one, but you've already discovered it. You've already tried to fix it. So you shouldn't get a finding. Okay. Find yourself out. Those monitoring links in there are so useful to you. I would take a copy of those, just because the way that the website's, been, you might not be able to get a hold of them, right away. And those are very, very useful documents. It tells you what they look for almost in every one of the departments that you're responsible for. Okay, so that is huge. Develop a corrective action plan to address any areas of noncompliance. Include the results and your corrective actions in your APR. Monitor, from HUD's perspective, they want to monitor the performance against your goals, check the relevance, the quality of the activities you're conducting. They want to see you identify issues internally before one of your other partners does, if you're working with somebody else or them, and to hopefully solve and correct those problems promptly. They're going to monitor you. They're going to review, do reviews for timely and compliant expenditure of your funds. Assess the risk of tribes not meeting your own expectations. Identify technical assistance and training needs. If you get nothing else, it's free. Put in for training if you guys need it. Come to this site as often as you can and get it from the Native Learning Center. It's free. All you can do is learn, so identify technical assistance and training needs, and the results are going to be provided in a written report. Okay. So ONAP is going to assess whether you have adopted a self-monitoring policy and procedures, you've conducted regular or objective self-monitoring, and submitted self-monitoring summary results with your annual performance report. There's a sample schedule, different departments that you could actually do, and when you should do them. As you see, they're not all right before the APR, they're staggered throughout the year. And it's, you're certifying that you're doing that. Do you have a procedure and a policy for self-monitoring pursuant to 24 CFR 1502, I believe it is, where the recipient is the TDHE? Did the TDHE provide periodic progress reports, including the self-monitoring report and annual performance report and audits to the tribe? And you're certifying to this, so make sure you guys are doing it. Did you conduct self-monitoring, including monitoring of any sub-recipients if you have them? And then your results. They want you to describe that. That's, in that area, what you monitored, what you found. So this is what it looks like, and those reference materials are at 20. Every one of those are an active link with multiple pages to them. Some of them are 20 pages, okay? But there's all your finance. There's your Title VI if you're going to do it. If you run the VASH program, there's one for doing your VASH, APR and IHP, lead-based paint. Even if you're not going to do the IHP, have your maintenance guys and your carpenters know about that. Environmental review compliance, labor standards, that's huge. All of that, organizational and structural monitoring, procurement and contract administration, the self-monitoring plan. So that will help you guys, okay? So this next module is your compliance criteria and your audit requirements and your development capacity, your project management capacity. Another guidance that goes back to 1999. So it's 26 years old, but they haven't updated it. So if you go to a HUD official, they're going to say, you go back to this. Determining recipient administrative capacity to undertake the Indian Housing Program. Okay. Just something for your reading enjoyment. It's a determination of that capacity. It establishes the basis that the department will determine if those funds are used and authorized, that you have that capacity to undertake that activity in accordance with the regulations at 1000 and the background. the oversight responsibility that arises, in 3 ways. Provides the recipients have to have administrative capacity to undertake the affordable housing activities proposed. The capacity includes the existence of adequate systems, internal controls necessary to administer these activities effectively without waste, fraud, or mismanagement. Section 405 of NAHASDA 1520 reviews the performance of recipients annually. Okay, that's during your annual performance report, including the recipients' continuing capacity to, carry out eligible activities in a timely manner. You have to demonstrate, pursuant to 1058, you have administrative capacities and controls to responsibly manage the investment of your block grant funds. And the notice addresses the first 2 situations, administrative capacity and the requirements for investing block grant funds. And there's new guidance on that, much newer than 1999. That's at 21. And that means I'm starting to run late again. So definitions and standards, your administrative capacity measures your ability to effectively undertake your affordable housing activities in your Indian housing plan in accordance with the requirements at 24 CFR Part 1000. That capacity can be demonstrated by a history of satisfactory performance, financial stability, management systems that meet the requirements of Part 85, policies and procedures meet the requirements of Part 1000, compliance with previous awards, experienced employees, existence of an organizational structure, development, operating policy systems, experience which minimize potential for fraud, waste, or mismanagement. In general, the basic requirements of 1026 and related systems will be evaluated in making a determination regarding recipients' administrative capacity to undertake the IHBG program. History of a satisfactory performance, that you have a proven record to, of acceptable compliance, performance, and implementing prior EWONAP, federal, tribal, and other programs in a similar nature. In addition to other areas noted within the notice, the following compliance areas are of a particular importance to the block grant program: Indian preference, labor standards, environmental clearances, lead-based paint, accessibility laws under Part 8, Section 504 Rehabilitation Act, and the flood insurance requirements. Your management capacity needs, your organizational structure, your program development management capacity, your capacity to administer funding sources, the different types of programs which you offer, your development capacity in case you want to build, program management capacity, property management, self-monitoring your performance and your compliance with that, and your financial stability. Previous programs administered in an effective manner, which have been maintained. You've got that financial stability of the recipient to undertake those proposed activities. If you're an Indian Housing Authority, the amount and trends in your operating reserves, so basically in your LOCS account, may be evaluated in relationship to your anticipated block grant amount. Your financial management systems in place for reporting, your accounting records, your internal controls, your allowable cost, source documentation, your cash management, your records retention, you're only as good as what you can retrieve when they ask for it, and your budget control. Then we have the audit requirements. So pursuant to 405, and you can read about this at 1054, so it's in the statute, and it's at 1055-44, excuse me, and 2 CFR Part 200. So you're going to read about little pieces of it all over. We have to have and comply with the audit threshold set by the Office of Management and Budget, which is OMB. An audit required, a non-federal entity, and that's what we are, who expends $750,000 during their fiscal year in federal awards, not just NAHASDA, in federal awards as a whole, have to have a single or a program-specific audit conducted that year in accordance with the provisions of that part. You have a Single audit, you can have an audit, because you expend the $750,000 or more during the fiscal year, with a single audit conducted in accordance with 200-514, except when you elect to have a program-specific audit conducted in accordance with paragraph C of that section. Program-specific audit election, it's when you expend federal awards only under one federal program, excluding R&D, and the federal program statutes, regulations, or terms and conditions of the award do not require financial statement audit of the auditee. You can elect to have a program-specific audit conducted in accordance with 200-507. That program-specific audit may not be elected for R&D unless all of the federal awards expended were received from the same federal agency, or the same federal agency and the same pass-through entity, and that federal agency and pass-through entity, in the case of the subrecipient, approves in advance a program-specific audit. Okay. Now, there are a few tribes dating back to like 1992, actually probably before that, 87 is when it started, that were allowed to get audits less frequently than annually. They were allowed biannual audits. Should your organization fall under that and meet this criteria, you can continue to get a biannual audit, okay? But you have to fall under that. So the audit expenses, are they eligible? Yes. Okay, if you're a housing authority, a TDHE, and all you're auditing is your program, you can pay for the whole thing. If you are a tribal department, you can only pay for the portion related to the housing portion of that audit. You can't pay for the tribe's total audit, okay? How does a copy of the recipient's audit need to be submitted to HUD? No, we are supposed to submit our audits to the Federal Clearinghouse, okay? You can read about that under subpart F, audit activities, but we don't submit them to HUD. And if the TDHE is a recipient, does it have to submit your audit to your tribe? And yes, you do, because they are the grant beneficiary and they are to receive a copy of your audit so it can fully carry out, or they can fully carry out their oversight responsibilities as far as NAHASDA. So yes, you have to give that to them. We also have to follow Indian preference and tribal employment and contract preference laws, okay? They are governed by the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act of 1975. It's Public Law 93-638. Several agencies, Interior, Health, Education, Welfare, and other government agencies to enter into contract, make grants directly to federally recognized Indian tribes. Tribes are going to have the authority for how they administer the funds, which will give them greater control over their welfare. Section 7B, Native American Preferred. Preference in the award of subcontracts, subgrants in connection with the administration of those contracts shall be given to Indian organizations, Indian-owned economic enterprises as defined within Section 3 of the Indian Financing Act of 1974. We have an Indian preference final rule. That program guidance is 2013-07, and it is also in your reference materials. It provides for tribal preference in employment in contracting. You can read about that at 1048, 50, and 52. And you have to implement Indian preference in all of your, contracting and bidding and things like that. You need to certify you have policies and procedures in place. You have to make sure that you have preference clauses incorporated into your contracts in advance and the advertisements that you offer Indian preference. The importance of Indian preference, special opportunities for Indian contractors and selection, mandates additional preferences for those contractors, for the laborers, subcontractors, suppliers, economic opportunities for your tribes, recipients, and your community. You are not required to hire an Indian individual or a firm. There's preference in your solicitation process required by federal and oftentimes your tribal law. You clarify those standards in your procurement policy and the standards from the very outset. It is applied in the selection of contractors, vendors, subcontractors, suppliers, in the employment and training of your contractors. Qualifying your bidders, your proposers, your vendors, specifically determine the individuals, the entities to, who are qualified to receive that preference, and don't rely on determinations and certifications that are made by other people. You have to declare them eligible for that preference. You are eligible if you are a member of a federally recognized tribe, the federally recognized tribe themselves, or entities at least 51% owned and controlled by such members or by such tribes. That ownership and that control, voting rights, management, decision-making, allocation of profits. If the entity is owned by a tribe or a tribal member, you have to show evidence of that ownership and that control. It has to be requested. You advise your bidders, your proposers, your vendors. Indian preference is required in your contracting. The parties have to seek preference, that want to seek preference, and they have to request it. When feasible, you provide your interested parties with an Indian preference qualification application. A variety of approaches, based on the size, regularity, and the nature of the procurement that you're undertaking. The more thorough the process you have, the better off you are. On large procurements, you make that determination prior to the submission of your bids or your proposals. You try to pre-qualify your Indian firms, and you include a determination that that bidder is a responsible contractor. Use an Indian qualification application, require supporting documentation. If you can get a panel to help you with decisions like this and looking at your contracts and your bids and things that come in, it will help you so much, and you can pay them a stipend to do that. I used, a man that was married to one of my tribal members that retired from a huge contracting company as a boss, and he helped me. We used a building trades professor at one time, different people like that have experience in this type of thing. It's very helpful to you as a director. Make independent verifications and inquiry. There's going to be people that try to get that Indian preference when they are not eligible for it. There's fronting processes. They're going to disguise how little profit the tribe or that member actually receives. They're going to say, yeah, they're 51%. They don't control anything. They can't even write a check. You have to find that out. You have to explore that. If that Indian tribe or member appears on paper as that owner, but the management and control are with the non-Indian, you don't give them Indian preference. If they're less than truthful in explaining resources that every owner brings to the entity, and you need to always document. Always, if your procurement especially, you document everything. Carefully record your decisions in writing. Be prepared to provide further explanation to anybody that you disqualify. And when you disqualify them, you tell them this does not mean that you are disqualified from submitting a proposal. This just means we are not going to afford you Indian preference. You reserve the right to disqualify anyone, even if you've already qualified them, right up until the award of that contract, in case you become aware of any new information or the entity structure suddenly changes. And you can put contract provisions within your contracts. You could terminate that contract if the entity loses its Indian ownership or control during your contract period. So applying that Indian preference, you certify that you have policies that's going to, afford Indian preference consistent with the ISDEA. And you can solicit bids from Indian owned and controlled entities only, or you can use what they call a two-stage method. That method, you advertise for bids, proposals limited to qualified Indian organizations, Indian-owned enterprises, and you utilize a two-stage preference procedure as follows. First stage, you invite or otherwise solicit your Indian-owned enterprises to submit a statement of intent or a response, that they're going to put, respond to your bid announcement or your request for proposal, an RFP. Limited, and you can limit that just to your Indian-owned firms. If you get enough responses, more than one, okay, the sweet spot in procurement is 3 minimum, okay, then you can actually limit that to only Indian organizations and Indian-owned economic enterprises. That's up to you. The more people you have to bid, the better prices you're going to get, though. For applying Indian preference, if any method of Indian preference results in only one bid, HUD doesn't like it. Okay, you cannot hire just one bidder. You'll have to rebid it. You always have to tell HUD that's going on. It's called sole sourcing. They do not like it. You re-advertise using any approved method of Indian preference. Re-advertise using, the X factor or other points preference. Or you can ask HUD approval, and you got to do that in writing, okay? You have to justify it in writing for review and approval of that proposed contract and the related procurement documents in accordance with 2 CFR 200-318 through 326. They don't like it. This is what using that X factor looks like. If you haven't had a procurement class, you probably should, and that will explain a lot more, detail, things like that. So small purchasing, Indian preference, procurements that are within dollar limitations established for small purchasing under 2 CFR 320 need not follow that formal bid or the proposal procedure, since these procurements are governed under the small purchase procedures. Your small purchase procurement shall, to the greatest extent feasible, always provide Indian preference in the award of your contracts. Preferences shall be publicly announced in the advertisement, the bidding, the proposal solicitation documents, and the bidding and proposal documents. You as a recipient at your discretion can require information from your prospective contractors seeking to qualify as an Indian organization or an Indian economic enterprise. You can require them to provide the following information before they submit a bid or a proposal, or at the time of submission: evidence showing fully the extent of the Indian ownership and the interest, evidence of the structure, the management, the financing affecting the Indian character of the enterprise, including major subcontracts, purchase agreements, materials, equipment supply arrangements, management salary, profit sharing arrangements, evidence showing the effect of that on the extent of that Indian ownership and that interest, and the evidence sufficient to demonstrate to your satisfaction that that prospective contractor has the technical, administrative, and financial capability to perform your contract in the work and the size of the type involved. I used contractors that could build 10 houses all day long. When it talked about an 80-unit contract, it was a totally different ballgame. They might not have the financing. They might not have, the labor and the workforce to build something of that size. So you always have to weigh all of that in there. So the work to be performed under the contract is subject to 7B. It requires, to the greatest extent feasible, preference and opportunities given to, in training and employment given to Indians, preference in the award of the contracts and the subcontracts given to Indian organizations, Indian-owned economic enterprises, and the parties to the contract have to comply with the provisions of 7B of the Indian Act. It goes all the way downward. All the subcontractors, everybody they use, should have Indian preference. That's what they should be offering. In connection with, the contractor shall, to the greatest extent feasible, give preference in the award of any subcontract to an Indian organization, Indian-owned economic enterprise, preferences and opportunities and training to Indians. They'll include that Section 7B clause in every subcontract that they put forth in connection with that project. So you just have to make sure that all of that is in place. Or you make sure when you hire your architect and your engineer, whoever's doing that on your behalf, if you're not doing it all yourself, be very familiar with this wording with Davis-Bacon, and they need to be familiar with the Section 7B provisions. Okay, so your preference, certified policies and procedures, tribal code regulations are in place, preference clauses incorporated into your contracts. Become familiar with that program guidance at 2013-07. These are some of those policies and procedures that you need in place. You're going to need Indian preference required documents, a policy, Indian preference policy, a preference qualification application, an Indian preference determination. They're going to qualify, you're going to determine them qualified or not. And then complaints policy for methods of providing from Indian preference. That's the grievance one that I was talking about. Okay. There's your Indian preference policy. There's part of an Indian preference qualification application. This is where you're qualifying them or you're disqualifying them for when they request that preference. And then there's your complaint procedure where it says 20 days. It's got to be 20 days or more. Okay, because you can't shorten it. That's the language that I was telling you about. So you need to have that somewhere in your documents also. And 15 minutes late, and I'm so sorry. There's so much information that I want to make sure that you have. I lost a couple of students during it at the end, and I apologize.
No worries, Cheryl. All that information is extremely important. So always best that you get through it. No problems there. I'm going to take back presenter. I have put the webinar feedback survey link into the chat, folks. It does change with each day of the training. So it's not the same one that you may have taken day 1 or day 2. It just takes a couple of minutes to complete, like 3 tops, lets us know what's working, what we can improve upon. It's anonymous, so you don't have to stress about your name or email being connected to it. We share it with our instructors so they get the helpful feedback as well. So good things all around. Oh, excuse me. We hope you can tune in for day 4 of the 5-day series. That'll be tomorrow, May 8th. Same time, same place. Like I said in the intro, now that you're on the learning platform, you'll just log in at the time of the webinar and you'll see that green banner to join the webinar. I apologize. So 2 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. Central, 12 p.m. Mountain, 11 a.m. Pacific, and 10 a.m. Alaska. We encourage you to check out this as well as our other recorded webinars on our YouTube channel. We now have a Catheta webinar archive playlist. It's our webinar recordings and some of our trainings for about the last 2 years. It's a really helpful resource, completely free to you. We encourage you to check that out. Send it to your friends, send it to your colleagues. And if you ever need help trying to find something specific, you can always reach out to me by email. And I can try to hunt down what you need if it's something that we have. I just put my email into the chat. We encourage you to check out our upcoming training events. We're on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter. We post about it there. We also have our in-house produced podcast, the Hopathanga Native American podcast. You can listen to that wherever you listen to your podcasts. And then if you like to view our special guests and the interviews with them, we post those recordings to our YouTube channel as well. But other than that, that is all we have for you today, folks. I hope everybody has a fantastic rest of their day, and we hope to see you again tomorrow for day 4. Thank you so much, Cheryl. I will talk to you tomorrow, but we appreciate all your time and expertise.
No worries. Thank you for the opportunity.
Always. I'm going to go ahead and turn off the recording, folks, but I am going to leave the meeting open.